So let me welcome you to another extra track covering the importance of usability in clinical informatics. Our today presenter is Kushniruk from the School of Health Information Science at University of Victoria. So we are back in Canada. Once before we had the joy to listen to Kendall Ho, which was or is already based in Canada. Now we are again in Canada with Kushniruk. And he is, among others, a director and professor in the School of Health Information Science, holds a undergraduate from psychology biology, MSc in computer science, and a PhD in cognitive psychology. So another well-established researcher between the disciplines. So we are happy to have you, Andre. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. I've been working in the area of human factors and usability for several decades now. So I'm going to talk about some of the projects from the past, newer projects, and relation to importance for clinical informatics. I always like to begin with how I got into this area and the definition of usability. And I'll talk about the ISO definitions in a moment, but the definition I started my work with and I still use today came from a human factors textbook that talks about usability as a measure of ease of use of a system in terms of a number of dimensions. And as you'll see today, the projects I've worked on focus on one or more of these dimensions. One is learning. How easy is it or not to learn how to use the system? And we can actually develop learning curves, like an electronic health record, for example. Effectiveness. Does the system do what it's supposed to do? And efficiency. Does it do it, but it takes 10 mouse clicks, but should only be 5? Fourthly, enjoyability, which is really user perception of satisfaction. And this early definition was quite good because it includes safety. We will be getting another presentation by my colleague in a couple next week, I think, on the relation of safety and usability. But where I came from in this a number of years ago was from the area of usability engineering, which I would define as scientific approaches to designing and testing usable systems. And as you'll see today, the applications vary from electronic health systems, decision support systems, AI systems, the same approach I've been applying on many, many applications. One other background point, many of you have heard the term UX, user experience, and probably asking what's the relation to usability. Well, user experience could be considered more of a superset, with usability being a part of the experience. It's important to have usability, but not sufficient. Systems must be useful for the clinician, desirable, findable, you have to know they exist, accessible, credible information, and of value in the end. So UX is kind of the broader term, although most of what we're putting usability labs are now relabeled as UX. And one other point about this is a bit of a metaphor of the difference between the two, using a road trip example, is that the user experience might be, in this metaphor of a whole trip, your expectations, using it, learning how to use it, and then what you thought about it after you didn't use it anymore. Whereas usability is how to get from here to there and do it efficiently. This last for definitions, formal international standards definition, very similar to the one I presented. Usability being the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. So as I've mentioned, the user experience definition is defined by ISO as a person's whole set of perceptions, experience, and responses that result from use or even anticipated use of a product or system. So it includes usability. Just some other background. I work in the human factors area, usability being a subfield of human factors, and work a lot with designers, testers, and evaluators of new applications in healthcare. And we often take the user-centered approach is that the user's complex task and workflow need to be analyzed to design systems that help in achieving goals. And some of the main principles that will come out in my examples is an early focus on understanding user information needs. Secondly, continually evaluating the design with end users. And there are pragmatic issues here. How often can we do this? Again, with interest in that, I've done a lot of work on this. And then the idea that this should be done throughout the whole system development life cycle, including after a system has been released and implemented. So the approaches that I've used and modified and adapted over the years fall in three categories. Some of you may have heard of usability inspection. Jacob Nielsen came up with an approach of analyzing an interface, not by testing users, but the analyst steps through applying principles or guidelines. I won't be talking about that topic today, but the focus of my work has been on usability testing. That is the area I like the most. I define usability testing simply as observing and recording representative users doing representative tasks with a system under study. So, for example, if I'm testing an electronic health record, I would get nurses or doctors who use the system, create a set of representative tasks, and then record them doing the tasks. And I'll show how this can be done very economically and rapidly. In my work, I've started by bringing in, since the 90s, an approach from psychology called Think Aloud, that you have the person think aloud while they're doing the task and recording the screams. If you record the screams and don't know what they're saying or thinking, that's not that useful. If you have a recording of what person is saying while they're using a system but don't know what they're doing on the screen, that's also not useful. So I show how to combine the two over many studies. And thirdly, my colleague Elizabeth and I defined what we term clinical simulations, which is extending the testing to include also representative environments. When we take the testing into the clinic or the hospital, we're moving from usability testing to simulations. And again, I'll show this can be done efficiently. So people will ask, when can usability studies take place? And in my career, I've done them throughout the entire system development lifecycle. Some of the projects I started at the beginning were more at the end of the development cycle when the product was released. But I've worked with designers. This is the system development lifecycle that goes through planning, analysis, design, implementation, and support. And on this slide, I just put examples of some of the usability methods that have been employed at each of these phases. So the idea is you may do some of the evaluation of the product, but you get more out of it if you're working in the earlier phases of the system development. And not so on here, many of the projects I work on involve commercial systems were purchased for millions of dollars in hospitals, and the amount of work and effort required to properly optimize them also requires usability approaches. So basic usability testing, the simplest approach is recording a user using a system. That's just myself recording. You can't hear me thinking aloud while I'm using a patient portal. And the approach is to record the interaction. So many free recording software now. If you have a Macintosh, you can use QuickTime. Recording it to the hard drive on the machine with the audio and the screens in sync. Some of the studies where I show this is that may require one or more external video views, but often we don't need that. So we're recording all the human-computer interaction, and based on that elemental recording, and so many examples today were much more complex analyses, but it's based on correcting that type of visual video data. And when COVID came along, it created a problem for doing studies face-to-face, and a simple approach to doing remote usability is simply to use Zoom. I could for example, set up a meeting, and you could open up your clinical information system, and then I can instruct you to use it for a particular task or purpose. And if you're doing screen sharing, I can record that. So again, many different ways to collect video data that is simple and non-expensive. I moved a lot to this after COVID when a number of my projects had to be done remotely. And just one other point is that many of the studies I've done also involve mobile usability testing or development of mobile apps at different phases in the development process. And in the past, people would use a document camera, but now we can record directly on to the device, or again, you could set this up as a Zoom meeting where the person is on the device, you'll see it on the screen when we record that. And other types of data collection methods, including smart glasses with video capability. But the main thing is that the data should be complete about the interaction. So the other thing that I've worked on is cognitive coding to try to understand human-computer interaction and do it in a way that's very pragmatic, that can help system designers optimize and design. But when a system has been released and there's some usability issues, I've often gone in to analyze what could be changed to improve, for example, adoption. So a range of approaches here, but as I said, typically involves observing users carrying out tasks. And in human factors, that's termed task analysis. And coding or analyzing the data. And this could also involve analyzing individuals or group interactions. So I've written a lot about what I call low-cost rapid usability, the idea that the testing doesn't require an expensive fixed laboratory. Rather, I've often conducted my projects by going to the site in other countries. I've been doing this in Europe and other places as well. Can be used to localize, predict, and rectify errors with a system using the coding I'll talk about. And in terms of fidelity of doing this, if it's conducted in the real or live setting, you can take the same recording equipment there because it's ubiquitous. So in doing a lot of my work, it falls into a kind of a framework I've developed with my colleague Elizabeth Baricki that we call a cognitive socio-technical model for human factors. And this has been actually a very practical model that kind of evolved out of doing consulting work, where we were interested in how to optimize clinical information systems. And so we define 3 levels. And at the first level at the bottom is what we call individual cognition. And we can study this by taking a user aside, having them interact with the system in isolation, using that basic usability testing approach I mentioned. However, if we optimize the system at that level, it doesn't mean it will end up being adopted. For example, once we put it into a clinic, this is level 2, we're getting into the area of users interacting with the system in a larger environment. And on the right-hand side, I put where we locate some of the methods that we have used. And finally, a system can be optimized in the clinic, but might not get it adopted. So that's getting up to more like ethnographic analysis at level 3 about what's going on in clinic. But generally, I have an up arrow that shows that if I'm working on a project and I've been called in to identify what's going on, I usually begin with the most constrained part of it, optimize the system at the level of 1, the individual user, and then move to the next level of looking at the system in a clinic or with a patient. And I have stepwise examples of how we have done this, and then finally I have an example showing how we have practically done this within a reasonable frame time for an individual, for a whole project for an implementation. So as an example of the think aloud, I always go back to one of the very first studies I ever did, was a system that was being sent out to physicians about heart disease guidelines. And we experimented with just recording the users interacting with it, thinking aloud, and using simple screen captures. Since then, and to analyze this, we didn't have this well-developed coding scheme then, but the coding scheme here was sort of, some of it was based on that initial work, but we refined it. So this is a video coding scheme that you can use as a frame of reference for looking at human-computer interaction. So as I said, there were different levels. You can see usability codes there at the bottom. Level 1, aspects of the interaction do the basic human-computer interaction, like navigation, speed, layout, organization, visibility of the information on the screen. That's a basic level that we can analyze with individual users. Level 2, we have explored and done a lot of work looking at the impact of systems on clinical workflow, because over the years this became an issue, is that even if the system was usable for the individual, let's say it affected my workflow, how can we modify it and improve it? And then other coding codes I've included, you may see this in a further example, also coded aspects of decision making and reasoning. But at any rate, the very first study we did, this was developed over a number of years. And I'll also talk about how the coding can now be automated using machine learning, like in vivo software. But other background on this, the Think Aloud study idea came from cognitive psychology, where they used it to study how people solve problems in physics, how chess masters play chess. I was one of the earliest people to apply it to looking at people using a computer system. So application to human-computer interaction, asking the user to think aloud, and then analyzing the data. So that's one example. Often I end up developing transcripts. They can also be generated automatically of the what was going on during the interaction, and then code them with annotations showing what the user was doing. So as you'll see in this kind of analysis, you can precisely locate what the user is doing and what problems they were having. This would be linked in my analysis to the actual digital movie. So this user would receive this decision support educational tool, and we had them sit down and try using it. And immediately, one of the first things we learned was that if information is old, people would turn it off. And this system was based on guidelines that were about 5 years old, and that was picked up immediately. We could look at different times in bold, like at 1 minute, 17 seconds, what they do, the checking out sex factor, looking at cholesterol level. So at the end of the coding, we end up with usually a transcript. The user in this application immediately got stuck and said, how do I fast forward? That was coded as a navigational problem. The nice thing about this is we were able to quantify how many and what type of problems occur and where in the system. So many of our consulting reports back to developers or implementers were able to tell them 8 out of 10 physicians are having problems in this part of the module, and this is the type of problem, and we can actually drill down using video tools that are very inexpensive or free to actually click on that number on the counter and go to that video sequence. So this was the type of data we collected. In many cases, we were surprised. This was for an application that was about to be released, and we also found it was very buggy and crashed, which wasn't expected. That was another type of issue that we weren't expecting. So as I would say that although this was done a while back, I've unfortunately seen many applications where we've done this type of testing and had to tell the developers, don't release it until you've fixed the following problems. And understanding problem, it had some audio and told the user to look on the options menu, and then the user facetiously says, I don't know which one of these is the options menu. It didn't come with instructions. So this was our first experience in applying this. Then we began to be interested in another sequence of studies of what would the impact of systems such as electronic health records be on, for example, clinician reasoning, decision-making, and workflow. So we wanted to integrate some of the analyses to include looking at cognitive aspects of usability. This is partly from my background. So again, this organizing framework, the previous example I showed you was looking at an individual user interacting with the system and having a hard time with it. That was level 1. Now, if we optimize at level 1, then we typically want to test the system, particularly if it's a critical system, at the next level up, which I call the level of distributed cognition. That's the level of the user interacting with the system and their environment to carry out a work task, which often involves other actors or participants. And this is where we bring in other methodologies. So for this, we published a number of studies. This was from McGill University, where we were actually, at the time, physicians were moving from paper to electronic medical record. And we recorded everything, including the training period that the company provided. And that was fascinating. There have been not a lot of published studies on how physicians are trained on electronic record systems or decision support, the actual training part of it. And one of the biggest adoption factors was about how the training went. This is another area of human factors I won't get into. But we also directly observed use of the system in practice while people were learning how to use it. So the framework we use for this is something that came from psychology called distributed cognition. And at that point, I started working on studies of doctor-patient computer interaction. So moving away from the study of individual ACI, but analyzing instead of think aloud the dialogue with the patient and the doctor-patient interaction in relation to what they were doing on the computer screen. So this was one of the first systems we tested this way. And the idea was interesting, although it was ended up purchased by the Canadian Defense Department. It had a lot of issues with it. It was kind of cluttered looking, and you've heard the term cognitive overload. But one of the things we found, this idea was there would be a laptop, and we could directly enter information or pick values from a list that came down, or add a diagram, for example. So this was so way back then, what we did, the paradigm was that the subject was a physician using it, interviewing what in North America we have OSCE exams and people playing patients, simulated patients, and recording that interaction onto the hard drive, plus an external video view of what they were doing in the room, because a lot of the times the interaction still today is hybrid, with partly on paper, partly on computer. So we had the physicians interview a simulated patient while using an EMR. That was the first time that had been done. And we also recorded the training as well. So exposure to EMR was associated with changes to physician gathering using the technology and reasoning strategies. Oh, one other thing I'll say is that we actually looked at the amount of information that was recorded in this particular system for the same cases that were on paper, and there was actually less information because some of the categories in the computer were not fleshed out. So we went back to the developers and told them that, and they fixed it. Working on this project, we were working with a medical education. I was in a medical education center, so we wanted to characterize how using the system affected reasoning patterns of students and physicians. And from that work, there was something called the directionality of reasoning, that experts often move in a forward pattern matching approach from particular pieces of data to diagnostic hypotheses, whereas in training, students in that often use, until they get to a more advanced level, backward reasoning, where they may start thinking about a diagnostic hypothesis and then looking at the antecedent conditions. So what we found was that when learning how to use a system, for many of the physicians, it inadvertently changed their reasoning pattern, and often they weren't aware of this until some time. So this was a transcript of the interaction with an experienced user who knew that the system was going to change their patterns. So actually worked outside of the system. This is a timeline creating a patient visit in the system, about to go in and select a filter in the system, but stops, gathers further information on paper, and then after 9 minutes goes in the system. So what we found is once in the system, they often became what we call screen-driven. What that means is that when they were learning how to use it, they'd be struggling about, I want to go somewhere else in this interface, but there was no sitemap. They couldn't move around very easily, except on that one page. So the patient came in and loaded the clinical filter, and they would often struggle with finding information. So sometimes they just flip to following the categories on the screen, and that would then drive the questions that they were asking the patient, which would then drive the whole reasoning process. This is how we connected it to forward and backward reasoning, and in general, kind of move them to a less than expert reasoning pattern. However, as I said, over time, people adapted to the system. They either adopted it or didn't adopt it, and then decided how they wanted to fit it into their own personal workflow. So the analysis led to looking at the concept of distributed cognition, that cognition and reasoning is not just in the person's head or the system, but it's distributed across different people, for example, in the clinic, computer systems, AI systems, and different representations. Could be things like faxes, printouts. And so we can kind of represent that interaction as a doctor interacting with the patient, interacting with the medical record system, and external representations like paper notes, reports. And we can experiment with different arrows here, for example, early on having the patient be able to see the record on another screen. So now there's an arrow to the patient. And we can look at the different dialogues between the doctor and the patient, but also we can consider the interaction of the doctor with the system as another form of dialogue. And to do that, we actually looked at mapping out and analyzing the interaction with the patient and the computer, because we have these recordings. In this case, we have marked out what the physician and patient are talking about. At the same time, the physician is essentially carrying out a dialogue with the computer system on something completely different, entering medications while he's talking to the patient about diet. So we find that this can often lead to cognitive overload. And we found different styles. For example, some physicians didn't use the system that much in the interview and waited for the patient to go to enter information, which often led to errors because there wasn't correct information, whereas other physicians focused almost microscopically on entering all the information while talking to the patient, and there were other forms of errors that were related to that. So we began work looking at styles of integrating electronic records into the clinical practice. And again, this is just to show that we were moving from looking at the individual level to the level of distributed cognition. So how did that apply practically to, say, current research we're doing? Well, we also began studying more recently virtual care using a distributed cognition approach. where we do studies where we look at doctor-patient interactions while using an EHR or EMR or decision support over the internet while they're actually talking or interviewing a patient. So we have one project with the University of Ottawa where we're looking at this, and we're basically able to do this recording everything over Zoom again. So we can code to assess other usability problems, what's the impact on the doctor-patient interaction, and I won't get into this lecture. One of the most useful applications of some of the methods I'll talk about today is in system procurement and selection. Previously in Canada and elsewhere, I've found that the process for deciding what system to buy for a hospital or region was often based on having shortlisted companies come and present demos. So early on, more than 10 years ago, I argued for usability testing to be included in procurement so that the people testing possible candidate systems are actually the real clinical end users. And that actually influenced how they selected the national systems in Denmark and Finland, applying some of these approaches. So again, there's many different ways some of this usability testing can be used. But our current work is also extending ways of analyzing the interactions of a video. So what we've developed is what we call coding dictionaries that have different codes to do with aspects of human-computer interaction. Like navigation problem, and we define in this table, define the code. Coded when the review of the video data indicates the user has a problem moving through the system. And then examples. For example, a physician user cannot backtrack to a screen to find the patient allergy tab, which can be a safety issue as well if you give a medication and haven't checked the allergies. Consistency problems. So we have a number of these. There's probably about 50 to 80 of them. Coded when there's a problem with consistency in the interface. And we can identify all these specifically using the video recordings. In one system we found it was a $100 million pan-Canadian health surveillance system, had 4 components, and we found it was confusing for the user because the way month and day and year was done was different in 2 components. Developers didn't even know that because they just put the system together. And then other ones will look at things like, does the system, is it impacting workflow? Our system status is visible, the users understand their messages. So we can identify specific usability problems, quantify them. In some of our work, we related this to safety. If there's a certain threshold of usability problems, it can lead to a very unsafe system. And what's its impact. And I will say, I don't go into this lecture, but I don't know if any of you use a qualitative coding tool called In Vivo, but that and most of the other current ones have new releases that allow for machine learning. So you can do some initial coding of the video and then let it run, and it picks up how you're coding it. Because one of the issues with the type of analysis I'm talking about today is people have said, well, it's time expensive and resource expensive. So we're looking at ways of reducing that using AI as well. So I've talked about usability testing with a couple of examples. And the other part I mentioned is moving to clinical simulations, where we extend the idea of usability testing. So representative users, again, representative tasks, but now we're doing the study in a representative or real environment. So ideally, I've found that the projects that were most useful for ones where we analyzed the clinical information system in the real setting it would be used with its interfacing technologies. And having said that, we can, at this point, say we want to do a more laboratory style study where we can control things. We may do a simulation, so The doctor-patient-computer interaction I showed you was really a form of simulation, a simulated patient interaction. And then we also may do naturalistic testing. Some of this may be recorded automatically or recorded using recording within, say, an operating room or a clinical ward. So I'll just give one example of how we moved towards that. This was around 2005 or 6, was a study with a hospital in Japan where they had purchased an expensive medication administration system, and they also, at that point, had implemented barcoding to integrate with the system. So we were initially going to do the study remotely, but that didn't work because I was in Canada and there was firewalls and that. So we simply sent instructions to a collaborator in Japan to get a hold of a few nurses and doctors after hours in a hospital room that wasn't being used. We set it up as the real environment with a dummy mannequin, and we create a set of tasks. As I said, human factors, we do task analysis where we had simple medication, intravenous administration, complicated ones. We also had ones where there were interruptions. We created a simulation, but it was conducted not in the simulation lab, but in the real environment. And this screen was actually a video analysis tool that was free at the time called Transana. And what it can do is it can link the videos, it's a video mixer if you want, in a sense. So there were two video views. There was one of the subjects coming into the room for the sessions, and that was done with just the Sony camera on a tripod. That would be on the left-hand corner. And whenever they went onto the laptop with a medication administration system, then on that computer we had a free recording software called Hypercam that would record exactly what they're clicking on. So if you play this, you can see what they're doing in the room, and when they go to the medication administration system, you can see exactly what they're doing. And so it was 2 video views is all we needed for this. And in this analysis tool, if you click on the black panel there that says subject 14, you could bring up the actual coding and a log file, I call it, of what they're doing. So you watch the video and then code it for what they were doing. First of all, searching for the patient on the computer, viewing the order list. So when this screen was frozen, they were actually looking at the orders. Then the user selection order, verification screen appears. The user goes over and talks to the patient, scans the patient ID, and then scans the ID bag, goes back to the computer, views the information, and goes on to the second order, the third order, the fourth order. So we were interested in just optimizing this interaction, and from the simulations alone, we found that there were times when the sequence was too rigid and they might have to break out of it, as the participants also know it. So at the end of doing this type of analysis, we often do a very quick and very semi-structured interview with the user about their experience they just had. So this is different from a focus group where people come together and haven't just used the system. I find this much more useful. So we can interview that user and ask them, do you find difficulty with handling the barcode reader? And the subject says, in today's operation, there were no problems, but in the real situation, sometimes the scanner doesn't respond to the barcode, and sometimes the cord of the scanner is too short to reach the patient, which was something we also saw in the video. But more interestingly, they also said, in general, they wanted a more simplified system for verification. The more patients are, the more difficult the verification will become. Sometimes in an emergency, we have to skip this procedure due to its time-taking process, and someone might need urgent help. But with this system, I don't think I'd be able to do that. So what we recommended was actually building in an emergency override. But the implications of this is that there were a number of other potential safety issues that had to be addressed before it went live. But these are things that were not considered by the designers or customizers or the implementers. And the idea was we wanted to catch these things before the system is released. But so often systems are released and then there's some catastrophic usability problem. They have to shut it off and go back. And this could also lead to patient harm or patient death. So we then argued for creating a layer of simulation testing prior to releasing systems. And that hospital continues to use our approach. I just have one other example. This was one where it was 2012, where we were looking at and I've done some papers on what I call pragmatic versus academic usability testing. Because if you're working with implementers or vendors, they often want quick results. So the idea is, can we package usability testing that's rigorous and at multiple levels, within a finite time that's useful for developers? So this was a project I did with Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, where they had adopted a particular electronic record system. It was Epic, and at the time they were just beginning to implement automated alerts onto the EHR that was layered on top. And so the project was called ICPR, Clinical Decision Support Automatically Triggered when the system detected likelihood of something like, for example, pneumonia. The objective was to do it in a way that wouldn't impede workflow and lead to better usability and clinical outcomes. So it also involved a clinical trial of the system later on. So we examined the components of the decision support. Well, yes, first of all, there's an alert that comes up called a BPA, Best Practice Advisory or alert. If you I don't know if we have Epic there, but you're probably quite familiar with that now. This was one that first came out. There was a risk calculator. If the alert came on, the physician could then go to a calculator that had evidence-based guidelines, ask a few questions, and then would tell you, say, the probability of pneumonia. It also linked up to an automated order set called the SNOT set that would give you a bundle of, say, medications or procedures to go with that, if that was found to be the conclusion. Also had documentation component. So we took apart the different components of it to analyze the usability. And this isn't this would pop up on top of this EHR, but on the top left was the actual what the alert looked like, yellow flag, and then if they clicked on that, then it went to, this was for strep throat. It would bring up that risk calculator, and then if the strep score was high, then it said likelihood of strep or pneumonia, and then if we click on that, it would go on the far right to a complete order set for medications that the organization was recommending. So you can see that the clinical decision support became like a suite of components. So to test it, we used the three-level approach. For one day, I flew down to New York, and then we created a test script where a physician would step through the different components and ask them to think aloud while they're doing it, recorded the screen. We also had the developers there, so they didn't want to wait for the analysis, so they were actually in the room observing the user interacting and trying to use this thing. But we instructed them not to tell the users anything. I wanted them to watch what they were doing and take notes if they wanted. So we had them thinking aloud while using the system where we triggered different guidelines coming up to see if they saw what was triggered, would they use it, would they accept the guideline. So we've also done other studies looking at why or why not guidelines are accepted by end users. So that led to a first phase where we optimized it from that point of view. And there were some very simple things that would have prevented people from using it. Like, for example, when it was initially presented, they didn't see where it was on the screen, and back then they didn't know what a BPA meant, so we had to spell it out. So some simple usability problems that were determined at level 1. For level 2, was similar to the doctor-patient computer interaction I showed you, but rather than a real patient, we created a digital patient. The reason we did that is we wanted to know, rather than forcing the user through, if the user got a case, how would they normally interact with the guidelines and the decision support and their own workflow. So we looked at workflow components of the system, when they were in things like the progress mode, when they were working on things like reason for visit, and this could all be analyzed at level 2. And then before it was released, we did some experimenting on recording its use live in the office with real patients. So the idea was that we started with the prototype of this integration of EHR with guidelines, did the level 1 usability testing, and this was all within the frame of a couple months. Redesigned fixes, then it led to the clinical simulation. There were impact on workflow that we again fixed, and then it went to a different project where one group got it and one group didn't, and lo and behold, the adoption rate was quite high. And we argued that is because we went through this optimization process. Now, with health information systems, there's often articles saying particular system X led to efficiencies in one hospital and led to bad effects in another hospital. And often they don't report the extent to which the system is optimized or not. And really, even with commercial systems, the impact of optimizing the usability can be incredibly important. So just from the recordings, I talked before about recordings, we also did that here. Here's some examples of COVID usability problems. The user says, one of them said it's becoming a lot of clicking and reading. If you want to do things quickly, it's a problem, especially if there's a lot of patients. Visibility, that you can see things on the screen. There was one quote from a user that says, I just see the label BPA alert here. Normally I wouldn't see it. I don't usually look on that part of the screen, but to be more prominent, I might have seen it had it popped up. Workflow was very interesting. There were a lot of comments about when the system would trigger. And there were some cases in that simulation where the system triggered prematurely with the suggestion that it was pneumonia, and the clinician didn't like that because they said, I haven't even ordered an X-ray. So it was, users were very sensitive to how it would be used, and some of them wanted the system used only at the end of what they were doing as a check, and some of them only wanted to use components of it, that they liked the calculator, but not necessarily the other components. So this user says, I think it depends when we start using the tool, because if you use it right from the beginning, you can get distracted. Implications of it, optimization led to higher adoption. Or that graph on the right that shows for the different clinical decision support components, the far right, alert, calculator, smart set, we coded positive and negative statements. And on each bar, the negatives were black, so it really didn't like the alert or the smart set coming up the way it did. But the calculator, they actually liked. Some people went in just to get that risk calculator. So we also recommended the calculator be also used as a standalone. The other thing we looked at was, because we can look at workflow using these methods, when and how often guidelines, what the trigger points for an adjustment. So since then, now there are many, many guidelines there, and this is still a problem because people will say there's too many of these alerts coming up, so I don't tend to read them, which is not very good. I'll just give one other example where we moved into some of our applications. I've worked with AI applications for decades, going back to the late 80s and the earlier iteration of AI, but more recently I'm working on some books on human factors and AI. because from my point of view, that was one of the biggest issues with AI, failing in the past, AI winters, and still is an issue today, is that there's far less work done on the usability of human factors of it. So I was fortunate enough to be involved in a study of the dermatology point of care AI application. This was a large project done with a regional health authority, a large company, and a small company that developed a really cool app that worked, and this went into real practice. So the objective was to effectively integrate AI-based imaging system into a regional healthcare system. And the technology is there for this. There's a lot of accurate AI using deep learning neural nets that come up with, I've seen articles in Lancet with accuracies 90, 95 or higher from the image, looking at the image. But the bigger problem from a human factors point of view has been, how does that technology get integrated into practice? It's nice to have an application that works, but how do we get it used? So the motivation for this and the technical solution, in Germany and Canada, there's often very long wait times for specialists. And this can be really problematic in cancer care because you often don't have time to wait if you have cancer. And if you're waiting weeks or months, it can progress, as you know. And unfortunately, the case is patients may wait for months to see a specialist or have a mold check. Every day of waiting can lead to progression of cancer. So the company developed a very nice application. It was targeted for the general practitioner office. It was a phone app that had a doctor called a dermatoscope. The GP was trained on how to take accurate pictures. We didn't have the patient taking the picture. I've seen some studies, but they often don't get adopted. This was the GP took the picture of the mole, a suspicious mole, and then in the crowd, it brought down images that matched that image of the patient's mole and ranked them according to how close the image looked and whether the image was malignant or malignancy, whether it was a skin cancer or not. So that allowed for immediate analysis by AI imaging software. And then if it looked like it might be a problem, the general practitioner in Canada, you can't go to the specialist until you've seen the general practitioner. At that point, they just hit a button and the report goes directly to the dermatologist with probabilities of it. It was careful not to say that it was cancer or not, but it was like rated in similarity. So it was a very good way of doing this without saying, well, the system is taking away my decision-making capability, which has been one of the human factors issues in the past and still today. So our study designed to evaluate the solution on a wide range of human factors. Even to begin with, we started looking at this using something called patient journey mapping. I've used a lot at the beginning of study, user-centered design. I'll show you an example in a minute. And we also have Zoom sessions with individuals, including specialists, GPs, and the patients who were aware that it's being used. They liked the doctors using it. We recorded the sessions and also did interviews, much like I showed above. And the data included audio and video files, and we also collected data on wait times. So what were the findings? I have it here. The solution was considered usable, but we could optimize it. Patients really liked the physician using it. It was reassuring to them and added confidence when we interviewed them. Training was perceived to be useful but for the physician, but needed some optimization. But the main ones were the speed for getting a diagnosis and treatment was substantially shortened using the AI solution. It substantially decreased wait times for diagnostic assessment of skin cancer. And also from the patient point of view, eliminated unnecessary stress waiting for a diagnosis. So as I said, we used journey mapping before we even got into usability testing. We wanted to target the AI, and this is something I'm currently working on, where AI can best be targeted. Before implementation, you start with going to the primary care exam with the general practitioner. They then would refer you to a specialist. There'll be a waiting period. We would eventually see a dermatologist. And at the time we did this in our province, there were very few dermatologists. There was a shortage. So we could wait months to get to the dermatologist. Then we get the biopsy. Have to wait for the results, confirm cancer, etc. So we decided where to target the application, and that's why we decided to locate the use of it in the doctor's office. And after implementation, we collected the stats on that. And most of the, from the primary care to the derm and the biopsy, if needed, got reduced down to, in many cases, a week or less. So the stats here were wait time from the GP to the dermatologist before doing this was 192 days. After implementing this, most of the referrals went from the general practitioner to the specialist in 5 days or less. And some referrals occurred on the same day because they hit the send button and immediately went to the dermatologist who reacted to it. We also optimized the usability of the AI application. And in terms of why this was successful, a bit hard to determine whether it was the AI app or the actual teledermatology component, but it was actually both of them together. So I'll just end with, and we have some discussion if we're around other applications. I've mentioned the electronic health record example I gave of this in support. We also have, I don't have a slide on it, but created a smart home simulation environment where we're testing assistive living devices using some of these approaches. I've mentioned that now. One example of AI application, mobile apps and patient portals. On the bottom right was a project I worked on that was 1998. It was the world's first internet-accessible patient portal. It was done in New York. And at the time, people said, oh, patients wouldn't be able to understand their own records. Fast forward to today, millions of, it was adopted by companies like Epic and many others that have direct patient access into essentially on the patient where they have that, and you can see pretty well essentially everything the physician can see, including pathology reports as they come out. And the question was this understandable or useful for the patient? So a lot of work going into usability engineering of that. So to conclude, to ensure system usability, quality, and usefulness, there's, I believe, a greater need for dissemination of low-cost, rapid methods, both for usability testing and clinical simulations, both in designing and even if you purchase the commercial system, you need this, because it could take years to implement a commercial electronic health record system. In a sense, you're almost implementing something new with decisions about how the screen should look, etc. And to deploy this along a wider range of projects. But methods do exist and are being perfected. So I'll just end with this. I think the title is the importance of usability for clinical informatics. My argument is success of all clinical informatics projects depends highly on how usable and useful IP applications are. And from actually the software literature from years ago, and applies completely in healthcare, if you look at often the single most factor for lack of adoption of a system, and that's a form of system failure, and that's quite high with many healthcare applications, is lack of user input, lack of user input in design and testing. So I've argued developers, clinicians, managers all need to be made aware of some of the skill and knowledge around human factors and usability in system development, planning, and implementation. And that is a really critical aspect for ultimate IP success. So I did a paper at the bottom there. Normally I've written papers for specialists, but it was in a journal called Healthcare Management Forum that goes to CIOs and management. And it was called Management Considerations and Trends for Human Factors. And have had a lot of pickup because there wasn't a lot of people writing about what does the organization need to know about this? What does the CIO need to know? CIO, Chief Information Officer, need to know. I'll just end with that if you're interested in any of this, my email address is andrek@uvic.ca. I just finished an edited book called Human-Computer Interaction in Healthcare, The Role of Cognition. It's a multi-chapter book with many of the methods I didn't have time to go into today as well. So I'll just end with that, and let me know if there's questions or thoughts. Thank you.
So as Sebastian is leaving, I'm taking the lead on directing a little bit the Q&A session. Andre, thank you very much. That was a really good presentation, really good talk. And I'm also looking forward for a good Q&A session now, of course, especially as I saw that we have also a few people, at least one from industry in the call. I think I saw somebody from Nexus Chile. Obviously, they have their own applications. And of course, maybe there are also some others, and including myself, where I would say less on the developing or producer than kind of user side, where you maybe select systems on the market and configure those and have then the choice of you have to choose one software as a service, or nowadays it's usually software as a service. So some of the providers, and you have the selection. And before I ask, maybe I have a list of questions, but of course, I would say I open it now for questions of the colleagues attending here. Any first move? I think I have to. Can you put yourself on, or do I have to? Or do you have to ask? I have to check because I'm the host now. If you want to talk, in the worst case, you have to put something in the chat. Otherwise, we can also open it for everybody. So no, I don't know if there's no questions or they cannot switch on their audio. So maybe you give an indication. I cannot imagine that there's no questions. So somebody typing, then maybe I'm starting with first question. So you had some slides regarding the last one with AI and dermatology, very interesting. And I can also imagine that this works quite well. I also know that in Germany, a lot of doctors are using similar stuff. I mean, not like to replace what they are doing with the patients, but to kind of have the AI scan the whole body and just speed up the process, right? So that they don't need so much for maybe the whole body, and the AI just points them to possible issues where they then spend the time on, right? Was there an investigation on whether the AI or the doctor themselves were better in false positive or negative? You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
that was done. I don't have that data, but it was what we found that it didn't really affect that, but it speeded the time up. That was the biggest difference. So biometric, the accuracy was looked similar to before, but it was just done within a much more timely period when the wait times were decreased. But
okay,
again,
so
as I mentioned, there's two components. It was the teledermatology and also the AI. But I think don't need to unpack what where the benefit came from. It came from the combination.
okay, good. Yeah. So again, any questions from? Okay, let's see, Sebastian's. Just check the chat. Okay. Can somebody indicate to me if you can switch on your Hermann? Can you switch on your mobile? Is that possible, or do I need to do that? You just they can. Okay, you can. Okay, good. Saskia, Hermann, any questions?
Yes, I have a question. At first, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering whether you think that usability testing methods need to be different for different technologies.
That's an excellent question. What I found with many of the technologies I've used, because I used some of the similar methods for electronic health records, clinical decision support, and now we're moving into AI. So the same methods can be used. The area I think is missing in AI, there were lots of studies done of efficiency and effectiveness, but a lot less how the system works in workflow. I give an example. A number of years ago, well, it wasn't that long ago, it was 2017, I was asked to do a study of IBM Watson oncology system. And I didn't end up doing the contract, but I remember going, talking with them, and I said, well, you certainly must have spent millions on it, have evaluations of how the system is being used in the clinic. And no, they actually had studies about accuracy, accuracy of diagnosis or what they came up with as a solution, treatment plan. But they had not done naturalistic studies. They had not done clinical simulations, and they weren't aware because they had the issue of some places adopting and others not. So again, some of the methods I'm talking about today are focusing on the integration of the technology cut across, even across AI applications. I'm currently writing a book on the relation of usability to AI. Yes, of course, there's some aspects of the testing you always modify to suit the application. When we moved to mobile apps, we kind of modified some of the methods as we saw. And we do some of that with AI, but in general, looking at the integration of the technology in a distributed human-machine system, we can plug and play the different technologies. So another interesting, yeah, so my answer is that a lot of the stuff I mentioned today is generic and can be adapted to more evolving technology. So we've done that over time. But the focus here is on how to bring the technology into use. And therefore, my argument is made that we need to use human factors and usability methods for that. So there's other evaluations, for perhaps of the, even explainability that can be done as a cognitive study. What do people understand about the explanation given by the system? So again, when the rubber hits the road and the user comes in, whether the system is a conventional system or AI, these methods apply generally. I hope that answers it with some adaptation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, other questions?
Andres, I think you mentioned the procurement one. This was one of a really interesting use of the method, because I have been looking at how large investments had failed in different projects. There was one project in the UK called Connecting for Health, that you may be aware. It was, I think, 10, 20 years ago, and they spent billions of pounds and terminated it because it didn't work. The project failed. So I asked them about how they procured systems, and the chief architect told me that they went to the US and saw demonstrations of the systems that they bought, some of them, and very similar to how things were procured in Canada. So I did a paper on how usability testing could be used to provide better evidence about whether the candidate system fits your organization. So I made a continuum of a low evidence where you just watch a demo person to high evidence where you require a test install of the system and the full usability test by those commissions at that hospital. So that was actually picked up in Scandinavia, and it became the standard practice now for purchasing reasonable EXRs and that, where the vendor now has to come and set up the system. And the nice thing about the usability testing is it not only shows whether the product is usable or not, but it will also show whether the product even has the requirements that were advertised. That it even did what it was supposed to, because we pick that up very easily if we get certain tasks and record the interaction. So that was a sort of the side effect of some of this that got used for updating procurement and system selection. I'm actually giving a talk about that tomorrow, and I call it "Try It Before You Buy It." Because if you can, and what does try it consist of?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's extremely important. So I think usually we also try to do a proof of concept where you really have the system in your hands. I mean,
Yeah.
I had this when I was in, I can say even when I was at Roche. I was 14 years working at Roche in Basel. And there we also looked at the system, and it was like the guy could show us everything, right? I mean, perfect pre-sales, God, right? And but then this was also the lead consultant. I was the project manager in implementing it later, right? So we selected it, and then from the God was nothing left anymore, right? We had tons of problems, even if it was the same consultant, right? I mean, this is sometimes really fascinating. A lot of people always look at functionality. They say, yeah, of course, it's included, right? Because it's maybe a standard system for that laboratory information management or document management or whatever, right? Or in the clinics, some X-ray system or whatever, so that you can do that you can do the diagnostics, right? But in reality, it's quite different, and that's I think it's good if you people provide a framework, because otherwise everybody tries to invent the wheel as well. How can we find out, right, what is best, or what does really work, right? And of course, and a lot of cost is always a factor. We all know that some systems or services are extremely expensive, and compared to maybe even open source, right? And I think that is a good decision factor. Then if you say, hey, mixture of or together looking at functionality and usability should be a good mix, right? Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
The other thing I found is having visual evidence, even if you don't code it to that level, because that's why I do that, but it's also useful. But for having that evidence, because there's often a disconnect from the people that are the IP staff of the programmers and the end users. So what I mean is the end users go back to the programmers and they'll say, well, that shouldn't be a problem. Anybody can use it. But if you start showing them, bring in some video clips and then show them where the users are having a problem, they'll go, well, that's how I'm usually use it. But by the time we show them 2 or 3 of the same problem, they'll go, I get it, I'll fix it. So there's often this divide from the user. So I've used it that way as well, as a way of communicating back to the developers. Or in the case I gave, we actually invited them to come and watch the session, with the caveat that they couldn't jump in and say, this is how you do it. We said, you can't say anything. You have to watch the user, in some cases suffering with the interface. Then they got the idea and went and fixed it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I imagine when I look at sometimes where I
Actually,
helped
so
some
I comment. I think I was meant. I'm from Dedalus, not from CDN.
Yeah, of course, yes.
I'm the industry representative, and I think both Denmark and Finland, they had massive problems when inventing EPIC. And there's a study, because I also have a background in academia, so I'm also kind of an HCI lady. And there's a study by Herztum, who is fairly well known in the usability community, where they were looking how it went. And it did not go very well. And they had issues from, like, I don't know, translating like the right in terms of the right leg and not like the correct leg. And I think there were, and I'm not sure if it was Finland or Denmark, the physician, like the clinicians were saying they go on strike if they have to use the system any longer. And in my opinion, I think the domain as a whole lacks an understanding of user experience design. And why usability is important, it's at the end of the development cycle usually done. Like this, most of the stuff we saw was about summative evaluation, which is when, I mean, the train had left the station and it will hit the wall. I think the crucial point is that you get all of this done very early in the development. So that you go and observe the user in their context, and then, because of course the developer, they will change if there's a lot of pressure from the market, but they don't want to change because it's expensive, right? And I feel what you said at the very beginning, that it's about iterative design, and it should not happen at the end, because when the system is ready, it's really hard to change. So what you should do is like testing paper prototypes and concepts very, very early. And I feel that this is something where the whole domain, and I joined the healthcare IT 2 years ago, and I've been working in different also B2B domains earlier. And I think it's just the field in healthcare is very immature. So there's a lot of things where other industry would say they would not accept this level of usability or lack of usability, while it seems that the clinicians they are so nice. I'm not sure if they are used to suffer, but the acceptance for poor UX seems to be higher in healthcare than in different domains. And I think that the key problem is that the market pressure, I mean, they're all nothing to write home about, right? So far, I haven't seen one system where I say, yeah, the user was in the center of the development. For a lot of systems, it's based on features and it's from developers for developers. And I think now there's a shift, and it's not only like my team I started 2 years ago, and my team was 8 users, now people, UX designers, and now we are over 20. And I've seen this also happening in the competition, that Meyerhofer is a small competitor in Germany. They're also investing there, but it's just about to start. And I think that's one of that's why we are where we are. It was always a second thought. It was about features and not about usefulness. Yeah, my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's really good, because I know about the Denmark one. There were articles written about after they got, it was an American system that was selected.
Yeah.
But they didn't test it enough, because they didn't. I saw another case where the usability testing caught lack of translation, but they obviously didn't catch the translation issue in the testing. That was an important one, that it wasn't translating properly. The other thing about that one, I remember there were 2 free systems. 2 were from the US, 1 was from Denmark. And probably the one from Denmark was probably more adapted to use in Denmark because it was developed by a Danish company. But it was almost like when the American systems came, they were the new toy, the new shiny toy. No one had seen them, and they probably went with the better of the 2, but still, whenever you develop a system in another country, we have this problem in Canada, and we bring it to another country, it never matches. The workflows don't match. The whole philosophy behind the system doesn't match. So it was interesting you mentioned that, because there were articles written, a year after that people were upset with the choice. And that one probably had a lot to do with the requirements that were used to develop the system, like I was talking about development of the system early on, were from another country. And we often have that problem when we import a system from another country, and then the testing is not sufficient. Like if there had been enough testing, they could have looked at the translation issue, but it got somehow left out, and that came back to be a big problem. I know some doctors were talking about not using it at all, but yeah. So a lot, and I totally agree with your comment. I've worked in other areas I've worked in transportation and nuclear power industry and that. And there are reasons. I would argue, I have another presentation about why is it so hard in healthcare. So many users, so many environments and that. But the level of the safety testing, for example, and the usability, it's often the pressure for pushing something out, and there's been more money spent on marketing than once commercial ASR systems out there. It's very hard to ever get them to change, once it's released, to change anything symmetric on the interface. So I've often been kind of working with organizations like hospitals and healthcare organizations on the other side. They want help in how do we select, or they want help in how do we customize the commercial system. But yeah, it's amazing how there's so many issues with the usability. And my last slide was that, yeah, this is like critical to the adoption and the good use of public money. And often management doesn't know that much about it, and hospital IP staff often don't know that much about it. So the argument for why more work needs to be done on this definitely not being solved.
So I'm on mute. So good. So I think we have max 5 minutes left if we want to be in time, and we want to be in time. Any other topics? Then maybe I would ask, which goes into the direction of what was just said. Let's assume you're a producer of a software, right? How would you do this best? I mean, of course, to assess how it works. I think we have seen that when you have a product or when you have a method and you run it, you observe it, you have cameras, you code the results, and then you draw your conclusions, or you have a study and say, okay, is it faster, like with the AI and the dermatologist? And yes, it works out. So you implement it because there's a business case, right? But how could you best do that when it's really about an early product development? So of course you have an idea what you want to do, and you have tons of options how you can design the workflows, the user interface. Maybe you want to do it a little bit really different than the competition, because usually you're not the first one to do something. I mean, you are usually not like in the Apple position of bringing out the iPhone. And of course, I think that was also very well thought through before they did it, right? I mean, that's they're very, very well known for that, right? And what is there? I mean, we have only 4 minutes left. Is there a good approach which you can tell, like, the industry what they can look at? Because there's a lot of pressure often to bring out the products, like the procurement guy or the marketing guys, they sold it already yesterday, right? And then of course developers and also the product owners and the guys who create the user stories and all of that stuff have pressure, right? So what can they do so that this fits into this whole framework?
I say one thing is that markups. You can do any of this with markups. It doesn't have to be a working system. And the better off you are doing it early, even while they're programming it, you could be doing markups of the interface.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but that means at some point in time, maybe they have to build some core functionality, because or maybe, okay, if you only do markups for the UIs and then you fake the result of the system, what it delivers, then maybe it works, right? And then it's possible to.
Well, that also can help you determine whether you got the right functionalities.
Actually, there are a bunch of methods available. So sorry to step in because it's my day-to-day. So what we do, we go out to the user and we follow the design thinking process, which is also it's not something which I invented. It is from the Stanford D School in the 2000er years. And it's kind of a framework on how to approach complex problems. And usually the first thing is to empathize with your users. You go out, and what we do, and we heard that, like, we map the workflows, and we don't go to one customer, we go to multiple customers. And I usually have the analogy of the Berlin public transport map. There you have like the circle line and the central line. And that's what we are interested in, because every customer will have their deviation. In the best case, you would have customer segments, which we don't have yet, but I think we would need it going forward. Mm-hmm. And then you understand, like, then we phrase problem statements. So what are the problems our users are trying to solve in each of the journeys? And there are methods like a user journey map, or task flows where you map what are they doing, what are the handover points to different users. It's then a long representation of the workflows of the users and we call it personas, like primary and secondary personas. And then we try with early concepts what could be like possible solutions, and then we test them. And it's not even a mock-up, it's a paper, it's an idea. And then we go to engineering, and the engineers cut our degrees of freedom, so it's too expensive. We have also something in place, or not yet fully in place, called a design system, where we define how should a button look like, and where should the main button always live. It should always live on a right bottom corner, so that the users don't have to search for it every time. We develop templates so that there's some consistency within. I mean, it's still a long way to go. I understand this. And it's not visible that much yet in Orbis, because a lot of the stuff that we are doing now is not there yet, because development takes very long. But there are some guidelines which we define, which we will stick to. And then it's going to the user and test, but test ideas, test paper prototypes, just talk. I mean, Jana's in the call. We have a lot of things with the digital health hub people from Münster, who then bring us users in, so we can validate our concepts continuously. So that's more or less how you need to do it. You can only do it with the user, and that's why it's called user experience and not stakeholder experience or product manager or engineering experience. But I feel currently a lot of the systems we have are not tailored to the user. It's more like an experience for developers sitting on a desk and having a lot of time to find the feature. So yeah. Yeah, that's about it. Now we're out of time.
Yeah. That reminds me of that contextual inquiry where you're supposed to go out, follow people around, and find out what the problem is before you make the system. And often that's not done. I found with earlier AI, expert systems failed. I went to a presentation of a famous developer who said if he built a game, he would have started going to the ICU to understand it before they made the AI. And I still see the same problem today, is that the solutions are often made and then we're looking for the problem that they solve. And there's still a lot of room for understanding, like you said, the user and their context in practical ways, and always having that input with the user. So the question could be another lecture is on what's the best way to involve the user throughout the whole process. But yeah, that's absolutely key.
Good. I guess we are more or less out of time. I would say thank you very much, Andre. That was a very good talk. Also, all participants, thank you very much for the really good discussions we had. And with that, I close the call. I think next time we have the topic of AI security, which is also, I think, of interest, especially also in the medical domain, as we all know. So here I also expect a very good discussion, and looking forward to your participation. Andre, again, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.